Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. Today I'm going to create some dimensional floral cards using the new Winter's Grace Garden collection from Spellbinders and Susan Tierney Cockburn. Now, I will link to a couple videos in the description below where she uses these two floral dyes and creates those beautiful orchids and paperwhites, and she does an amazing job. She's clearly very gifted at it. So for these particular flowers, checked those videos out before creating mine, simply because I like to create flowers, but for these particular flowers, I wasn't sure of the anatomy and how some of them were supposed to be shaped. So I checked those out before creating mine, how I wanted to create them. But I highly recommend checking those ones out because they are absolutely amazing. So the first card I'm going to create is an orchid card, and I'm using the Cymbidium Orchid and Ladybug die. I've got all my pieces cut out here. I used some sage cardstock for my greenery, for my leaves, and then I just used some white cardstock for the florals because I wanted to use some inks to ink them, and I wanted to have some really light or almost white edges to them. So I'm using a sticky mat here to hold my pieces while I do my ink blending, and I'm using some Spellbinders ink blending brushes. These are nice and large and they're very fluffy, so you can really create a light ink blend or you can get heavy with your ink, so you have a little bit more control over it. And I wanted to use these because I wanted to have, like I said before, some white towards the tips of the flowers, and I wanted a little bit more saturated color in the middle, and I figured these were going to be the best ones to get me the look that I was going for. So the first color I'm using here, these are Distres pads. I'm using Spun Sugar. I used some bundled sage on the greenery first, and then I'm using Kitsch Flamingo on all of the pieces here. And then I'm going to move these pieces to the side, and I'm going to take the flower centers and I'm going to use some Kitsch Flamingo as well as picked raspberry on them. I want them to be nice and bright or dark pink. And I'm trying to concentrate the ink mostly on the top part of the pieces as you see them here. However, I have them upside down on the map or on the mat. So when I go to put them on the flowers, this piece is a little bit, or is on the bottom part, and the kind of pony out piece is on the top. So I wanted to add just a tiny little bit of dots as well as shimmer. So I'm using some Distres spritz. I have it mixed up really well, and I'm taking the sprayer out of the bottle and just tapping it with my finger to get those splatters on those die cut pieces. I wanted to do it with the Distres spritz because I wanted to have the shimmer part of it as well. I didn't want to add a ton of color to those particular ones. For the flower centers, I'm using some distressed spray stain in picked raspberry as well. Again, I'm wanting those splatters, but I'm not necessarily wanting the shimmer for those center pieces. So I'm putting the shimmer on the flower pieces, but not the center, putting the color on just the center ones. While those pieces are drying, I have a mat here that I have cut out using the Perfect Touch Rectangles and Tags die set, and I'm just using some tumbled glass distressing. My mind went completely blank there. And just doing a little bit of light ink blending on the outside. This is the piece that my florals are going to go on. I wanted there just to be something a little bit more interesting behind them than just a solid color, and I wanted that to kind of frame those florals. I'm going to do another mat for the outside of this, and it's just going to have some picked raspberry on it. I'm using my paper shaping or my flower shaping toolkit here. It comes with that little clear bag to hold everything in, which is so handy. And on one end of my tool, in one, I have it's kind of a, I don't even know what it's called, but it is a loop, and I'm using that to shape the flowers going from the outside to the inside. So typically when I'm shaping flowers, I'm using the ball stylus. So this was a little bit new to me, and this was one of the things that I learned from Susan's video. She uses this tool to shape her petals, and I thought it would be great to give it a try and use something that wasn't normally how I would go about doing it and seeing what the differences were. I'm also using the tweezers to kind of curl the ends, as well as the tip of the tweezers to kind of point the ends of the petals and shape them. Again, another tip from Susan's video. I highly recommend it. Mine, I'm happy with the results, but they don't look nearly as good as hers. So she's definitely done it many, many times and is very familiar with each one of these flowers and their colors and their shapes. I love flowers, I just can't keep them alive, so I don't pay too much attention to them, and paper flowers are more my thing anyways, because I don't have to water them, so I can't kill them. So once I have all of my pieces shaped, I can start layering them together. And I always find it's easiest to do all of the shaping, or as much of the shaping as possible first, and then doing assembly. So for the little 2-pieced floral pieces here, I shaped them with that same hook or U-shaped tool that's in the kit, going from the outside of the leaf to the inside of the leaf, inside of the petal, and then using those tweezers to shape them and curl the leaves or the petals outside. And I love the look that these two tools give to it. I'm using the foam block that comes with that paper shaping or the flower shaping toolkit. It's a really good one to work on. It's nice firm foam, but it still gives you some give to it. If you don't have this, you could always use like a mouse pad or something like that, but it's not too big, so it doesn't take too much space to store, and it comes in really handy, especially for things like this. So once you have all of your pieces shaped, or at least these 2 pieces shaped, you can put the 3-pieced petal on top of the 2-pieced petal. And on the 3-petal die cut, there's one petal that's different from the other 2. That's the one that I have facing up. And then I have the 2-piece die cut or 2-petal die cut that has the petals facing up as well, and it's glued behind it. For the inside part of the flower, we're still using that same U-shaped tool, and I'm doing that little piece in the center, working my way from the top to the bottom, and then the 2 pieces beside it, and then doing that petal ruffle on the bottom. And then on the other side of my tool, I have the small ball stylus, and I'm just using that to push the center in and indent it a little bit, giving it a little bit more of a cup shape to it. Once again, I'm going to use the tweezers just to kind of shape some of those petals out so that everything isn't hidden in that center there. It just adds a little bit more natural curl to it. And if you find doing that you lose some of that cupping, you can just take that ball stylus, push it right into the center again, and you will get that back. I'm using liquid glue to glue everything together. I use liquid glue most of the time anyways, but for things like this, it's especially helpful because it gives you a little bit of wiggle room, and then you can just set it aside to dry. I have them just drying off to the side, and then while those are drying, I'm going to work on my leaves. Now it almost looks like a piercing tool in the kit, but it has a little bit of a curve to it. That's what I'm using for the leaves, and that's because that's what Susan did. I'm doing it a little bit different than hers. She did that on the back and then used a pen to highlight it. I chose not to do that. There is a little piece, it almost says really thick chipboard that's white in that kit. That's what I'm using to do these leaf pieces on. It doesn't have as much give as that black foam, so it works perfect. You can get those lines in there, just like the lines that orchid leaves have in them. And it works perfect, and I love the final look of that. With all of those leaves shaped and my flowers shaped and dried, I can start assembling my card. Now, at first, I had thought I was going to put this just on a white card base, and then as I'm putting it down, there's too much white space. I don't like having this much white space to it, so I cut another piece of cardstock, do some quick ink blending with that picked raspberry just to tie in the floral colors and frame it just a little bit more. Adds another layer to it, and I like the final look of this better than having that much white space. Now, normally, if I had done this ahead of time, I would have grabbed my sticky mat to hold this in place just to do this, but because I had glue that I didn't necessarily want to completely dry on that blue piece, I was just doing this on my glass mat just to get it done really, really quickly. We're not going to see much of this piece, so it doesn't need to be completely ink blended all the way to the center, just the outside parts. And once again, because those florals have gradients of the different pinks, I didn't feel it necessary to be heavy-handed with that ink and completely make it a dark pink. I have it dark towards the outside and lighter towards the inside, and it complements the flowers a little bit better in my opinion. In that Orchid die set, there is also a stem, and then there's also an extension part of the stem. I'm just using the extension on the top, but I'm not necessarily making it as long as it could. I have probably about 3/4 of an inch overlap, so there is some areas that you can customize it for the surface that you're putting your florals on. Next, I'm going to put some glue on the back of those florals, and then I'm just using the ball stylus to hold it down and just press it into that glue. Now, because this card has so much dimension to it, personally, it's not one that I would put in an envelope simply because it would crush some of that or flatten some of that. You could put it in a padded envelope, or if you were wanting to send it to someone, put it in a box with a gift or whatnot. Otherwise, personally, it'd be one that I would hand to someone so that they could appreciate that dimension and that I wouldn't have any chance of flattening it. With the florals in place, I can tuck in the leaves where I want them to go. And I'll typically do that where I put florals down first, and then I will insert the leaves and use that to fill in different areas on my image. I find that's the best way to do it. If you prefer, you could always do your leaves first, but I like to do it afterwards. That way I can see exactly where it needs to go. Now for sentiments, I'm using the Nature's Botanical Garden Sentiment press plate and die set. This is from one of the last collections with Susan, so it works perfectly for this. It has botanical themed sentiments to it, so it works perfectly for floral and botanical cards. So I'm just using Hammermill Cardstock here. I don't necessarily need the impression from the BetterPress. I'm just really wanting those particular sentiments to go with these cards because they work so perfect. I use the Bundled Sage Distress ink because I know I'm going to be doing 3 cards here, and I know they're all going to have greenery with them with that Bundled Sage. But at this point, I hadn't decided all of the colors that I may possibly be using. So I didn't want to chance using a color that was going to clash and having to redo my sentiments. Because I knew they were all going to have greenery, I knew green was going to work with all of them. So this worked perfect. I did do it twice because the first inking it wasn't really completely solid. So I did want a little bit more ink on there, and the second one worked perfect. If you have to do it a second time, just be careful when you're doing your inking so you don't accidentally move your press plates at all, because otherwise you're going to have double pressing and it's not going to be in the same place likely. So with those sentiments done, I can now tape down the dies that come in the set, and I can die cut those sentiments. I'll use one for this card, and then I will save one or the other 2 for the future cards in this video. These, again, are all botanical themed. You don't necessarily have to. You could use, say, a plain happy birthday or something like that. I just liked the fact that they coordinated really well with these florals. So I'll be gluing this sentiment down, and I'm just going to cover the bottom part of the stem. It's one of those areas that I don't find very interesting, and it's a perfect space to put that sentiment on there. Now I am going over the dimension of the stem and the leaves there. If you wanted to have a sentiment that was a little bit more flat, you could use some scrap cardstock and die cut the sentiment a couple times, and then build up the layers on the left and the right side and have a hollow center, so to accommodate for those die cuts there if you wanted. I'm going to set that aside to dry, and now I'm going to work on the next card, I'm going to use the Paperwhite and Glass Vase die set. Now I did have the vase die cut out of vellum. I end up not using it on this card because for the size of card that I was wanting to make, which was 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, it was just too big, and I didn't have the room to accommodate the flowers, the bulb, and the vase. So I'm going to set that aside. I'll store it with my die set, use it on a future project. But if you do want to use that vase, vellum's an excellent choice, as well as acetate if you wanted it to be really, really clear. I'm using that same bundled sage on my leaves, and those are cut from sage cardstock again. And then I have some Barely Peach cardstock here that I die cut the bulb part of the die set out, and I ink blended it with some vintage photo distress ink just to get that brown look to it. And then with a brush that didn't have some fresh ink on it, went on the roots of that bulb. The centers of the flowers here are really tiny pieces that are actually yellow, so I'm doing some ink blending on them with some squeezed lemonade. I did it on both sides of the cardstock because these centers of the flowers get rolled. I knew I was going to see both sides, so I wanted to make sure that both sides were colored. Another option here would be to use or to die cut some yellow cardstock. For shaping these, I'm putting them in my tweezers, using some small scissors to cut in the spikes or stamen, or I'm not sure what they're called, and then using some liquid glue, feathering those pieces out a little bit, and then I use some tweezers to hold them off screen so that that glue has good contact while it's drying. It doesn't need to be held for long, but I find that if you have it in some tweezers just to hold it a little bit while it is drying, it's not going to start unrolling itself. So I'm going to do the same with all 3 flowers here. I'm creating 3 flowers for this card. You could make as many or as few as you like. The die set lets you know how many times to cut each die to create a cluster of flowers. So I think for the 3 petals there, I think it said 6. For the centers, it said 3, but it does say right on the die set how many it recommends. So for shaping these Paperwhites, once again, I'm using that same tool. It has kind of a U shape to it in a bit of a curve. I'm going from the outside of the petal to the inside of the petal, and you can see how automatically it starts shaping that flower there. For these particular ones, you need 2 of these 3 petal die cuts, and then once they're shaped, I put some glue on the back of one of them, and then set them together, and then set them aside to dry. For the card that I'm creating, I'm going to create 3 Paperwhites, so I cut 6 of those 3 petal die cuts. And then there is a center part that cups up. I cut 3 of those, and then 3 of the yellow pieces, or the pieces that I colored yellow for the center. So after doing the first one, I realized that I hadn't done this part of the die shaping. Once again, I had watched Susan's video, and I found it very, very helpful. To be honest, I don't know if I've ever owned Paperwhites, so I wasn't totally sure exactly what the finished look should be. I think you can have a lot of creative leeway when it comes to doing your own flower shaping, but I always love to take inspiration from actual flowers and see what they're intended to look like or what colors they actually have while creating them, just to kind of create as much of a realistic look as possible. So I'm going to do this for all 3 of them, and you can see how easy it is to shape them. This is one of those things that I think having a bunch of pieces die cut and then watching a movie and sitting down and shaping flowers is a great way to do it, because it takes some of the monotony that could be or could happen with it. I also think this is the type of card that you would create for someone special. It's not something that you would be doing on a mass production scale, or at least I wouldn't. This is something that I enjoy doing, but I don't think I would enjoy making 20 of these cards, of each one of these cards. I like to do 1 or 2 and have fun shaping those flowers and just creating something with a little bit of dimension, but I wouldn't want to mass produce it. That's just me. Other people might like that sort of thing. So with those pieces of the flowers done, I can do the little cup piece. This has a little cup very similar to daffodils. So I'm going to use that same tool, go from the outside to the inside, and then there's a little bit of a V notch. I put a tiny bit of glue on the side of one of those V notches, overlap it with the other piece, and then use my tweezers to hold those in place while they're drying. And just like the centers of the flowers, they don't need to sit there being held for very long. The Barely Art glue that I like to use does start to set fairly quickly. So I want to say 10, 15 seconds, maybe 20 is really all you need. And in the time it took me to shape, I have 2 pairs of tweezers that are reverse tweezers that will hold things. In the time it took me to do the first 2, by the time the 3rd one was done, I could take the tweezers off the first one and it had set long enough. So it doesn't need a lot of time at all to set. For the leaves, I'm using the paper piecer tool that has the little hook or the little curve to it. Once again, using the piece of white chipboard for my base. For all the cards, I'm going to do the tumbled glass ink blending around the outside of the die cut. Again, this is die cut with the perfect touch rectangles and tags. I like this because it cuts the rectangle, but there's a little tiny notch detail that happens when you die cut it, and it gives a little bit more interesting look than, say, just a plain rectangle. So once again, I'm heavier with the ink on the outside than on the inside because I want to just frame in those florals. I don't necessarily want a solid background. If I wanted a solid background, I just would have used some solid cardstock. I think it looks a little bit more interesting sometimes when you have a little bit of ink blending and it's not totally even. You have some lighter areas and some darker areas. Because I knew I was going to want less of that white space behind the card, I did the same cut piece or same size of cut piece that I did for my first card. This time I did ink blending with that squeezed lemonade because I wanted it to tie in with the centers of those flowers. Now this piece here was die cut or was trimmed down to 5 3/8 by 4 1/8. You can see there's very little of my card base showing. I wanted to see a little bit more of that color than of the white of the card base. So with these bases or with these mats glued to the card, I can start figuring out how I want my assembly. And this is where I decided not to use that vase because it just went too high. And I thought it would look a little odd having that vase down there and then having those flowers not high, much higher than the top of the vase. The stem itself from this die set comes in 2 different pieces, and I did ink blend the top of the bulb part with that bundled sage, which is fairly close to the sage colored cardstock that I used for the top part or to die cut the top part. Now I'm going to glue down the base of the flowers, and you can see with that liquid glue, I have a little bit of wiggle room. As I'm putting different pieces, the other pieces are going down. When I have my when I have the pieces exactly where I want them to go, I tend to just press them down for a few seconds just to give that glue a little bit more time to hold. And then I'm going to glue in the little cup or the center pieces for those flowers before gluing in the yellow stamen pieces. Once again, putting or using the ball stylus part or the tweezers or the tip of the tweezers to just push down the centers of those flowers and make sure that they have really good contact with that glue. And I'm going to do the same thing with those yellow pieces. I found that if I just placed them in there, they kind of went a little bit cockeyed, but by using some tweezers to hold them down, I could just control exactly where they were going. Then I'm going to take one of the sentiments that I made with the last one. I'm going to put that right over the stem as well. Once again, the stem part's not the most interesting, so I figured it worked best there. After doing that, I realized that I had forgotten to put my leaves down, so I took that sentiment off and then assembled my leaves or added my leaves to the arrangement. It would have looked awfully boring or awfully weird without having those leaves there. So I always die cut or do more die cuts than I really need when I'm creating like this. It's always nice to have a large selection of what you need. Anything that's left over, I'll put in Ziploc bags and just store with the die cuts because I'll use them in future projects. But it's much nicer to have too many die cuts than have to stop in the middle of a project and re-die cut or add some more die cuts. So here is the finished result of the Paperwhites. I absolutely love the look of them. And I think it would be really easy to simply do a little bit of yellow ink blending and create daffodils if you wanted. You could completely eliminate the bulb at the bottom part if you wanted as well. For my third card, I'm going to use the Norwegian Rosemaling embossing folder. This is part of this collection as well. I'm going to use both the orchids and the Paperwhites. I'm not going to use any of the stems. I'm just going to use the embossed background and then add the florals to it to embellish it. Now I'm doing my orchids fairly similar to how I did them in my first card. However, for this one, I'm also putting fossilized amber Distress Spritz speckles on my orchid. I wanted to be able to tie them in with those Paperwhites, and because they have a yellow center to them, I figured it would be a great way to coordinate them. So the centers of my orchids now have some gold yellowy flecks as well, so it coordinates nicely. The orchid die has a ladybug to it, and I thought this would be a perfect time to add that ladybug. So I just die cut them out of red cardstock, and then I use a black Copic marker to put in the details. And to add a little bit of different texture, I added some glossy accents on there and set those aside to dry while I was working on the rest of the card. This is the beautiful background or the beautiful embossed background, the Norwegian Rosemaling. I am doing an A2 card again. You can see how easily this would work well for a 5x7 card. it works perfectly fine for a smaller card as well. You just have your image going off the edge, which is again is totally fine. I wanted to do that same tumbled glass ink blending, but I wanted to be fairly light here. I want more of that embossed background to be highlighted for the center. Because I'm not using any stems, I decided just to put a tiny little bit of green ink blending on the top of that embossing, just a tiny bit. Most of it's going to be hidden under the flowers, but I wanted just a touch there, just to bring out that embossed image. My background here is cut to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, so it covers that entire card base. I figured there was no point in having or cutting it smaller and losing some of that beautiful embossed background. So I have 3 orchids here and 3 Paperwhites. I'm just going to have them glued on that embossed background, kind of at a curve. I don't necessarily want all of my pink flowers to be clustered together. I want to mix them in with some of the whites, so I kind of alternate throughout. I have a few leaves left over from the first 2 cards, so I'm just going to use those behind the flowers just to add a little bit of greenery, tie that in. But once again, having any stems is not really necessary because that whole area is covered. You're really not going to see them anyways. Now I put my leaves down there, but because of the embossing, they didn't really want to stick very well. So I just use a large acrylic block. I use this often when I have cards drying. I'll put an acrylic block down to hold everything nice and flat, make sure that glue has good contact, and it just frees up my hands to work on other things. And you can see, because I'm working with liquid glue here, it kind of wants to lift up as I'm putting in and pressing in other flowers. I don't mind this because it gives me the creative freedom to move things and change my mind. However, if you didn't want them to move, what you could do is glue your flower down, wait 30 seconds to a minute till that glue had time to really start setting, and then glue your next flower down. I like having that glue not set because I like to be able to move things until I've finished making up my mind. But that is a way to do it if you didn't want to chance anything moving on you while you were creating. You could wait and let that glue set a little bit longer before putting your next piece on. Now, when you die cut these ladybugs from this die set, there's 2 that get die cut out of there. So I'm using both of them on this card. If you wanted an odd number, you could die cut more. And it's a great way to use up cardstock scraps because they take up so little room. But they're a great accent to these cards. And the fact that they have glossy accents on them just gives them some shine. So it gives them a little bit of extra texture. Now, because of these flowers, like I said before, they've got so much dimension to them. So again, it's not a card that I would put into an envelope, maybe a padded envelope, but I think that would still crush some a little bit. It's one that I would hand to someone in person, and I love all the floral dimension that you get. You could even take these and create like a shadow box frame with them and use them that way as a gift, and I think they'd be absolutely gorgeous. I love these floral dies, and I love all the dimension that you can create with them. I hope you enjoyed watching this, and once again, I highly recommend going and watching Susan's video to see more about how she shapes them and she colors them. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate the time you spend with me, and I hope you have a fantastic day.